Let me begin by reading the English translation of a hymn by Tukaram, a saint of India of the 17th century. I have attained him. I found a sea of love, an inexhaustible flood. I've opened a treasure of spiritual knowledge. It diffuses the luster of a million suns, arisen in the worshipper's soul. Unexpectedly, without an effort, I've heard the eternal secret. I've learned to know God. The seed of the high reunion has been enfolded in my own destiny. I've now beheld him in whose sight is all goodness, a sea of happy augury, the supreme power of mystic words. I've attained him whose name is nectar, whose nature is pure, whose intellect free from passion. The very joy of peace and compassion is found in this joy that accompanies the knowledge of being and knowing God. The subject of our talk this morning is healthy-mindedness in religion. There is physical health. There is what is called mental health, which is very important nowadays, and what is called spiritual health. As far as physical health is concerned, even the strongest man, a person having a strongest physique, is not completely immune from disease. But he does not think in terms of disease. There are innumerable microbes or bacilli in the atmosphere around us. Only when we become weak, these things attack us. Otherwise, we can altogether ignore them. A healthy person altogether ignores them. When a man becomes unhealthy, then he becomes victim of these things. Or when a person has become mentally unhealthy, he thinks there is dangerous microbe, there is everywhere. There is germ and wants to protect oneself, and by the very fact one wants to protect oneself so much, one falls a victim. It has been found even in the case of smallpox, when a mother nurses the child, mother does not very often get attacked. But that is not a case, that is not any illustration which should be enforced on all. But we find when one's mind is on higher level, one is not attacked that way. I know of a case, a Swami, a disciple of Ramakrishna, went to see a TB patient. It was in an out-of-the-way place, in a dark, dingy room upstairs. That patient wrote a letter to him. And the Swami, usually he would not go out, and he would not go out except by cars, because at that time he was aged and he had to do important duties at the time too. But he went by tram, streetcar. And the attendant of that Swami followed him. He was surprised to see that he was going out alone. and the attendant followed him. Afterwards, he met him in a streetcar. He went there, and the TB patient, in a senseless way, offered him some fruits. And he took them, he ate them. And afterwards, the attendant intensely blamed him. What did you do? And he said, don't you see, he gave with so much feeling. His feelings will be hurt. And when one gives with so much feeling, it will not affect me. It did not affect him, at least. In any case, those persons who see germs everywhere are afraid of these things, easily get attacked. They forget health is the normal condition of life. Disease is a case of aberration. This is true of physical health. And as far as physical health also is concerned, we can make it into a mental case. Thinking always in terms of disease, we become so much mentally ill. And there are persons who are really mental cases. In life, we have to face many problems alone. Many persons are not trained emotionally or intellectually to face those problems alone. The worst of it, because they have not right training or they have not lived in right atmosphere. They seek advice from others. And when you begin to seek advice from others, for all things, you weaken yourself. And the more you weaken yourself mentally, the more you begin to seek advice, the more you become weak mentally. That is how these cases of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, counseling arose. Now I understand even children or young boys are psychoanalyzed. I don't know whether there is any age limit that below which a psychoanalyst should not analyze him or her. Yes, many persons have to face the problems of life alone. But when you magnify these problems because of circumstances, and we make ourselves weaker, and we make ourselves a mental case. Ordinarily, we have to face these things. Ordinarily, a normal case, a person would be able to face the problems of mind too. When there is a good background, emotional stability in early age, living in a normal family, one will be able to do. But when we magnify our problems of the mind, and by magnifying those problems through imagination, we make the case worse, we become a mental case. With reference to such persons, the problems of mental health arise. I don't know whether so much attempt to cure or ensure mental health is good for our minds or bad. In the same way, there is what is called spiritual health. It is much more important and it is much more difficult, because in spiritual life, in a nutshell, we want to attain perfection. We want to attain perfection in this human frame, knowing full well to earth is human. Human frame, which is a bundle of imperfections. In this human frame, we want to have perfection. Naturally, the task is difficult. And psychologically, when we want to have perfections, our imperfections are much more visible to us. When there is a white sheet of cloth, dark spots are very clearly visible. They become so prominent. In the same way, if not to others, we become conscious of our imperfections. And as such, when we find it is very difficult to get rid of our imperfections, to cure our imperfections, the problem becomes much more acute and it creates trouble. And some persons might develop morbidity of mind too. There it is necessary how to keep up the spiritual health. One should be cautious how to keep up one's poise in spite of all difficulties. One enters into spiritual life knowing full well that there will be difficulties. It is said, unhappy is the lot of those who do not strive after any ideal. 1,000 times more unhappy will be the lot of those who aspire after certain ideal. There will be bold persons who will not go by the easy way, will choose the difficult path. They will still strive after some ideal, strive after some perfections or complete perfections. They are ready to give the price for it. They know they will have to give price. But that does not mean one should be foolhardy. One should know how to tackle the problems, how to steer clear of difficulties as far as possible. If we study the life of Christian mystics, I find sometimes it has occurred to me very painfully. Many of them have magnified the dark forces of life, the dark forces in our life. Sometimes I would think, what is it due to? It might be the Christian outlook, at least theological outlook, is a bit different. They start with the idea of original sin. And that original sin is being handed over to us from generation to generation. We are born in sin. Though there is God who is all love, who is all powerful, they cannot forget the idea that there is devil. Not only that, they give too much importance to devil, as if God has abdicated his power in favor of devil. In any case, we find some of them at least magnify so much the evil things in our life, the dark forces in our life. Sometimes it becomes pathetic, sometimes depressing, sometimes frightening. It is said of John Bunyan, the author of Pilgrim's Progress, beautiful book, but in his life he had what is called religious melancholy. Sometimes he would be so sad, he would think perhaps animals are better because they have not the consciousness of sin. They do not know what sin is. He develops such a morbid attitude, if I can use that expression, to life. Why should there be so much sadness? Even in a book like Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis, such a beautiful book, there is an element of sinfulness. It is so much so that one cannot, at least some of us cannot stand there. Good things we read, those things we just ignore. It is said of Martin Luther, he was so powerful and strong, but even he, it is said in his old age, one day, he was saying, he is tired of life and so on. One student said to him that why you should live 40 years more to do good work you are doing. He said, 40 years? I am ready to face hell, then live for 40 years. Just see what a pathetic condition. He was spiritually great, otherwise he could not start such a movement. But even then there was that, if I can use that expression, a little sadness, a little morbid outlook. It is said of Saint Anthony of Egypt, who lived in 2nd century, and he started, I think, the first Christian monastery. He was struggling so much with the forces of unconscious mind. He'd be seeing terrible pictures, terrible sights, and so on. He'd be fighting constantly with these things. He would imagine all the fancies would become visible. Thoughts would take shapes. In our mind, various thoughts arise. If we begin to take note of every thought, if you begin to receive every thought that you see, then it becomes a dangerous thing. There was such a bitter struggle, terrible struggle in his life. Yes, he became a saint, but this struggle seems uncalled for. Why so much struggle, or why so much wrestling with dark forces, or why should he give so much importance to these things? As I said, there are microbes and bacilli all around. Don't take note of every bacilli or microbe. It is said of Tolstoy, a person like him, at the age of 50 or so, he became so much morbid in his outlook, in spite of his love for the teachings of Christ and so on, that he would be afraid to live alone for fear he might commit suicide. He would be afraid to go hunting with a gun for fear he might shoot himself. He was obsessed with the problem of what for, why, wherefore. His unhealthiness of mind was of different kind. In any case, he was so much obsessed with that idea, he developed that unhealthy attitude. But there could be healthy outlook in spite of the problems of life. It is said of Walt Whitman, he did not talk too much of theology, but he had such a healthy outlook on life. He would look at the sky, he would like every bird, he would be fond of flowers, trees, and bushes. It is said he would never complain against anything, whether disease, problems, men, woman. It could be hardly said that he disliked anyone, and everyone who came into contact with him would feel that he loved him or her. The source of his strength or healthy-mindedness was, he would look at the open sky, he looked at nature, he would constantly charge himself with strength from nature. Not only that, he got something from that. He got really something. Therefore, he could keep up this attitude. No wonder in the modern age in big cities, people have no time or have no opportunity to look to the sky or look to nature, objects of nature. Only thing they can look at is the ceiling up or the walls below. All throughout the day, one looks to the ceiling when one lies down, or one can see the walls around. Life is so much cribbed and cabined and confined. Therefore, more or less, unhealthy attitude arises. When once somebody read from Christian scriptures to Ramakrishna, he said, why there is so much consciousness of sin? He could not stand that idea. He would say God is God of love, God of light, God of strength, God of bliss. Why do they speak so much of sinfulness? Not that we have not faults, we have enough of faults, but why should you give importance to them so much? Vedanta says there are two things, ignorance and light. Vedanta does not talk in terms of devil and God, sinfulness and redemption or salvation to believe. Rationally, there are two things, ignorance and knowledge. When you say ignorance, you cover all the faults that man has. And it means when you say ignorance, it is not part and parcel of your life or your nature. It is something superimposed which is not yours. So we take all the faults under the category ignorance. And it has this advantage. When knowledge comes, darkness is removed at once. There might be very thick darkness, but however thick the darkness, however long-standing that darkness may be, when you bring in a light at once, all the darkness is gone. So don't, bit by bit, begin to think of this imperfection and that imperfection and so on. Take all your imperfections as a whole, and these imperfections, whatever might be the cause, are due to ignorance. So think of bringing light to your life. That is the only way by which darkness will go. That is the only way by which your imperfections will be removed. But by trying to wrestle with your imperfections, bit by bit, you cannot do anything much. You exhaust yourself only. Think of light. God is light. It is said in a prayer, O Lord, at one glance of thine, all of a sudden you can remove all my ignorance. All ignorance of life you can remove. That is a positive outlook. That is the right outlook. That is a sign of healthy-mindedness. So Vedanta emphasizes very much on strength to have a right outlook. Because we go in a negative way, we think we shall become fit and then we shall come before God. But God will take us in spite of all our faults, and God will remove our faults. It can be done in two ways. Yes, I admit there is a way of struggling. Just I must make my life better. But even then, one must have a positive outlook. We should try to develop the good qualities and not emphasize too much of our faults. It is not good to find too much faults with others. Nor is it good to find too much faults with oneself. One can be hard with others, one can be hard with oneself. To become too much hard with oneself is a form of disease. Some persons make a bravado of saying they have this fault and so on. But that is also unhealthy attitude. There is bad weather. When you begin to be too much conscious of bad weather, that is not a normal thing. Think of positive virtues. But that does not mean we shall not have to struggle. Yes, we shall have to struggle. When you are in a voyage, then there will be waves, there will be many difficulties. But all that is wanted. We do not begin to count every wave that comes along. And if you keep a record of all the waves and high waves and all the storms, all the cyclones that came, and you can leave behind a hideous picture of your spiritual life. But a normal sailor will think, these things will come. Why do you take too much notice of it? A disciple went to a saint with his difficulties, and the teacher said, you could not stand because the wave was a bit too high. Affectionately said to him. He knew there will be difficulties in life. And so the teacher affectionately told him, we found it difficult to stand because the wave was a bit too high. In India, a real spiritual teacher, a man of God, does not talk much of spiritual things, of difficulties and so on, too much of counseling and so on. Just understanding the nature of the student, he will give the advice, some simple advice, and leave the whole to him. Following that advice into practice, the student, the disciple, will build up his spiritual nature. And he knows, a true student knows the difficulties will come, but he has got the asset, he has got the source of strength, he has got the weapon with which to fight the difficulties of life. That means by following the simple instruction that he got from his teacher. Sometimes it is good that we do not get too many instructions, because when you get too many instructions, and nowadays through printing press we read so many things, but they do not sink into our mind, sink into our personality. If you are to sink a well, don't go from place to place. At one place try to sink until you get water. That is the attitude. Follow that instruction into practice, everything will come. In the instruction is the remedy, is the panacea against all the difficulties of life, of spiritual life. And what happens when the difficulties come? One should have the right attitude. If we can have the right attitude, then we can keep our head above waters. When you swim in sea, you should be careful to keep your head above waters. In the same way, when we are swimming for life in our spiritual struggles, what is most important? That we must have the right attitude, right outlook. So the Upanishad says that one must have the right outlook on life. So also said Buddha. Buddha gave much emphasis on right aspirations and right outlook. what is meant by right outlook. The Gita says, when we have some intense desire, and if that desire is not fulfilled, we get angry. When we get angry, we forget ourselves for the time being. And when we forget ourselves, there is delusion. When there is delusion, we do something wrong. In the same way, in spiritual life, when you cannot keep the right attitude, when you cannot keep our head above water, the difficulty arises. We are under delusion. We are under temporary insanity, as it were. As for instance, suppose very, very great difficulty comes in our spiritual life. We can always remember that with us a thing might be impossible, but not with God. There is no difficulty which God cannot solve. And if we look to God for help and guidance, why can we not think that that difficulty, however great, will be removed? Just it is a common sense, it is such a simple thing. But when struggle comes, we forget. And as a sort of egotism, we think we shall solve the problem single-handed. You cannot fight the problems of spiritual life single-handed. Fundamentally, it is wrong. So you develop unhealthy attitude. But even under greatest difficulties, you can keep the idea that you do not fight your spiritual problems alone. There is God who is ever vigilant, who is present everywhere. This simple thing we cannot keep in mind because we are under temporary insanity, as it were. We are under delusion. With reference to this, perhaps the Upanishad gives so much stress on the idea that one must have a right attitude, right outlook. And one should be reflective, one should be discriminating. Not that we can get our weapon just when the fight begins. We must keep our weapon ready and keep the weapon always with us. We must develop from day to day by thinking, reflection, developing discrimination, the right attitude. So when the difficulty comes, difficulties cannot overpower us. And after all, no difficulty is permanent. In life, everything passes away, everything changes. Even if the difficulties come, they are only for a period. The darkest cloud, the thickest cloud may cover the sun, but that is only for a period. In the same way, in our spiritual life, difficulties come, but they are only for a period. There are ups and downs in life. Even Swami Vivekananda said in one of his lectures, at times we feel that we are very close to God. And again there comes a mood, we feel that we are far, far away from God. It is so significant, especially coming from a person like him. And in his life also we find that these instances. While Ramakrishna was alive, Swami Vivekananda had various spiritual experiences, some of the highest type, as it were. But when Ramakrishna was physically absent, then problems began anew, as it were. At times, even he said to M, the author of Gospel of Ramakrishna, he said the pathetic, they were discussing what Ramakrishna said about Vivekananda and what spiritual experience he had. But even after that, when Ramakrishna was physically absent, difficulties came, problems came, and he began to say, sometimes I feel that everything is false. I become skeptical. Just imagine, it is interesting that these records are kept for us. Even the tallest persons, even after getting high spiritual experiences, feel at times skeptical. There might be reasons behind it, but we can find that one has to pass through these stages. So we are not the lonely fighter. We are sailing in the same boat, even with great persons, even with the tallest giants. What is wanted? To have always the right outlook. Sometimes this morbidity, even in spiritual life, comes out of bodily ailment. So the Vedanta says one must be strong, at least mentally. Usually find when the body becomes sick, one cannot think very strongly, one cannot think very boldly. Outlook becomes very poor, very low. It has been found that spiritual experience, without taking care of physical health, when they do spiritual practices too much in momentary enthusiasm, they ruin their physical health and they ruin their spiritual prospects too. Therefore, one should be cautious. Unless we have come to that state when we have been able to transcend the limitations of body, it is good to be sensible to keep one's body all right. This cannot be too much emphasized because with spiritual aspirations, many in all countries become so enthusiastic. They forget everything. Yes, you must strive unto death, but that is not striving from inside. Your spiritual intensity of life should be so great. This is one thing. And another thing is ambition. That is what is called spiritual ambition. You want to get it quickly. That's a sort of ambition. When the spiritual intensity is genuine, then you can wait. You can struggle intensely and you can wait for years, for ages, patiently. Because it is your genuine spiritual aspiration. What can you do if the result does not come? With whom you can fight? You have not seen God. If you could talk with God, you could fight with Him. But here, without knowing God, you are simply fighting with wind, fighting with the air. So there the difficulty arises. There is another difficulty. Sometimes the ideal might be too high for us. When you read many things, we may feel that at once we are fit for the highest ideal. But that also requires preparation. So the Vedanta, especially in the Gita, the great emphasis is given on doing the normal duties of life. Psychologically, it is so effective. When you at once try to fight with your mind, spiritual life means fighting with mind. At once you go to fight with the mind, you are in great disadvantage. You can work, but you cannot meditate long. But if you can do the work with a right and spiritual attitude, you strengthen your mind, you strengthen your outlook. That is the great advantage of work, doing the duties of normal life. But not that any work will have any spiritual effect. Those normal duties should be done with a spiritual outlook, with a spiritual motive and purpose. And gradually, when one becomes fit, normally one will be able to think more intensely of spiritual life directly. But many, just all at once, wants to have the high ideal. Here I find many persons coming for interview, not always members. I can see at once they want to do something. At once they will meditate for 8 hours. If I get alarmed, they will think that I do not know. And they will spoil that, they will derange their mind and spoil their body. And it depends on outlook also. As I said, right spiritual aspirations. What you really want, that is the most important thing. Recently I got a letter, and the writer says, he had read in some book written by a Westerner of a Hindu ring in a book called A Book of Prophecy. He asks me whether I can give direction as to where that Hindu ring can be had. He has read in that book, if you get that Hindu ring and if you meditate on it, the ring will give you the knowledge of the future. So he wants the Hindu ring, and he says his aspiration is just to get into contact with some wealthy and influential man so that he can influence him. So I got these things. I did not think. First I thought, what is it? Then I thought, it is not worth giving any attention to. Just see what does the man want? What is outlook? What is his aspiration? Spiritual life is difficult. Though we make it difficult, it is easy when you have real love for God. But it is difficult for ordinary persons because they have not genuine love for God. It requires practice to have genuine love for God. And over and above that, if you bring in all these things, weird things, naturally you make yourself a victim and you run the risk of being mentally deranged. So what is meant by healthy-mindedness in spiritual life? It means we must accept that in our life, in our spiritual life, there will be difficulties, small or great. However great the difficulty, God will protect us. If we think of God, if we want to reach God, we are not fighting with an enemy. We are not fighting with a hostile force. We are fighting with God. We are trying to reach God, who, according to every religion, is all love, is all power, is all love, is all blessing. Then if difficulty arises, why is it that we cannot keep into our mind the idea God is love? This is one attitude. This is the kind of healthy-mindedness. We do not ignore difficulties. We accept difficulties. Normally they will come. No one is immune. So difficulties will come and the solutions also will come. And in this way, if we struggle and not actuated by ambition, as I said, spiritual intensity is good, not spiritual ambition to get a quick result by some easy means, by some yogic process. You cannot have it. In this way, if one struggles, one will find that one is healthily struggling. There will be no morbidity. And in this way, when genuine love for God arises, after struggle, there will come genuine love for God. Then the life becomes easy. Even spiritual struggle becomes a joy, becomes a source of great bliss. So in spiritual life, however difficulties, the problems before us, Let us remember, we are not fighting with hostile forces. God has not abdicated his power. God is love. God will take care of